Welcome back. Well, we've all seen the headlines: tainted peanut butter, E. coli infected spinach, or apple juice, or hamburgers, salmonella in peppers and tomatoes. What will happen next? Well, in this lecture on food safety, we're going to cover some very important key points on how do we keep our food supply safe and what is our role as consumers. Although the United States food supply is regarded as one of the safest in the world, there are still concerns with food products becoming contaminated, as evidenced by the recent outbreaks. So what kind of protections do we have, and what information do we know about food safety? Well, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, estimates that each year in the United States, food-borne illnesses cause sickness in 76 million people. I want you to think about that for a second. We are always concerned about the new pandemic, whether it's avian flu or swine flu, but this is a real and tangible threat to the American health. Sickness in 76 million people. It results in approximately 325,000 hospitalizations and over 5,000 deaths. These foodborne illnesses can be caused by numerous factors and can be prevented to a certain extent by the consumer. So we all have a role in food safety. We need to know not only about making good food choices, but also about preparing, handling, and storing food carefully. We all have our own family ways of managing food, whether it's preparing or handling or storing food, and sometimes we might be the responsible culprit in the food poisoning incident. This lecture is going to help to keep you aware of the food that you are consuming by introducing you to food contamination methods. How do we get ill? What are the consequences, the signs and the symptoms? Who regulates this for us? Who are our regulating agencies? And probably most importantly, how do we prevent this? So let's explore how foods become contaminated. Well, we've got three major methods. It can be biological, it can be chemical, and physical. And certainly most of us think about the biological methods of food contamination, and it's probably the most common. It mainly occurs during the processing and the preparation of foods on site. These problems may be traced to food preparers not washing their hands, very, very common cause of food poisoning, or not changing latex gloves when preparing different foods. So what that means, that someone may mix ground beef with latex gloves and really not think about the fact that now they're cutting tomatoes. So it can be not changing latex gloves in between different stops in the food supply chain. Certainly cutting boards can be a source as well. Using a cutting board for meat or fish and then jumping to preparing raw or uncooked vegetables without washing the cutting board or using a different one. Certainly you can get colored cutting boards, and as a home strategy you can get colored cutting boards and use one just for meat, maybe red, and then the green for produce, and don't allow for that cross-contamination. Certainly under biological methods, bacteria, molds, viruses, and even parasites can exist in the food supply. Now obviously these are very small organisms, microorganisms that you may not be able to see. Well, bacteria is the most common cause of foodborne illness. It can enter the food supply during different stages of the processing. And most of it is killed or inactivated by adequate cooling or cooking procedures. So sometimes just being respectful of temperature guidelines can oftentimes minimize your risk of developing a foodborne illness. More than 90% of all foodborne illnesses are caused by bacteria, and of the bacteria that we consume, only about 4% is pathogenic. The remaining 96% is harmless. Keep in mind, this is oftentimes what we call the probiotics. It can be used to produce items like cheese, yogurt, sour cream, fermented foods, for example, pickles, sauerkraut, and some soy products. We've talked a little bit before about helpful bacteria, but now we need to look at the evil demons of pathogenic bacteria. Pathogenic bacteria can cause foodborne illnesses with gastrointestinal consequences. And chances are, if you're listening to this lecture, you've experienced food poisoning in the past, and so you have an up-close and personal relationship with the gastrointestinal consequences. The infections are the majority of foodborne illnesses. ingesting harmful bacteria that grow in your intestine, replicate, and create the infection. So what are the common ones? Salmonella. It can contaminate food and water. Probably poultry products and eggs are where most people are going to think of salmonella. But it's simple things like stuffing birds at Thanksgiving and not cooking to the proper internal temperature. Remember, oftentimes respecting those temperature gradients can be enough to prevent foodborne illnesses. And so one tip that I'm going to give you is get a thermometer. You can't guess at internal temperature, you must measure internal temperature. Certainly when I was growing up, I had pet turtles, and I remember my mother saying, wash your hands, wash your hands. And yes, even pets can be a source of foodborne illnesses if you don't wash your hands. Listeria is one of these bacteria that can survive a wide variety of pH. It also has the ability to grow in temperatures ranging from 39 degrees Fahrenheit to 111 degrees Fahrenheit. So what does that mean about the temperature gradient? That means the food has to be lower than 39 degrees, and if you're cooking it, it has to have a higher internal temperature of 111 degrees. The problem is Listeria is found in foods that you don't normally heat, things like lunch meat. Certainly unpasteurized soft cheeses, such as feta and brie, as well as Mexican-style soft cheeses. Pregnant women should avoid these unpasteurized soft cheeses for just this reason, because there's not going to be a possibility of killing Listeria if it's in these soft cheeses. So again, if you're pregnant or contemplating pregnancy, avoid the soft cheeses. Shigella. Shigella oftentimes is associated with poor personal hygiene of the food handlers and is the main cause, so just about any food can carry it. Again, these bacteria enter the intestinal tract and start to produce a toxin within the intestinal tract. But the big one here is E. coli. E. coli and its varying strains, the CDC estimates that 70,000 people become ill each year from E. coli, and some people are going to die from it. So where does the E. coli come from? It comes from fecal matter in the food or the water supply. So again, it's that inability to wash your hands in a very respectful way after using restroom facilities. It can contaminate undercooked meat, unpasteurized apple juice, and certainly there have been outbreaks, and many of the food manufacturers are now looking at unpasteurized juices as a healthier alternative to pasteurized. But when you pasteurize a juice and you heat it to high temperatures, yes, you may kill some of the, or denature some of the beneficial compounds that are in that juice, but you're also killing the pathogenic bacteria. Raw sprouts can also be a source because raw sprouts, again, are very difficult to wash, and once the E. coli gets embedded into that sprouty mixture, it becomes difficult to wash it out. So knowing that you would do a better job of washing produce maybe than the food handler would, eating raw sprouts at home would be the safest bet that you can control infection. So it'd be my recommendation, avoid that on a salad bar. Fresh produce can be contaminated as well as water. So again, E. coli is going to be the one that most of us see in the press, and certainly the ones that most of the tainted food is going to be contaminated with. Campylobacter jejuni can contaminate raw meat, undercooked poultry, unpasteurized milk, and untreated water. And I have to tell you, in my clinical practice, what I see is I see a lot of individuals who are going out to dairy farms and buying unpasteurized milk and believe that it is more natural, it's going to help their immune system rally around bacteria because they're going to be exposed to that bacteria in the unpasteurized milk. And I would really dissuade individuals from doing that. Certainly if you grew up on a farm, you might have had unpasteurized milk, but as a family strategy, always choose the pasteurized milk. Now, staph and botulism are usually separate from the other diseases because they behave a little bit differently. They produce toxins, sometimes referred to as enterotoxins, entero meaning gastrointestinal tract, enteral toxins. Bacteria can grow on the food, it releases toxins, and it's the toxin that causes the illness in the person consuming this toxic food. Staph aureus is one of those bacteria. In almost all healthy humans, we carry this bacteria in our nose. So it's easily transmitted to food through coughing, sneezing, and improper food handling. So if you go to a salad bar, that's one of the reasons why they have a sneeze guard there to prevent the contamination of that food. Clostridium botulinum is a little bit different. It can occur in improperly home canned foods. Certainly you can see sometimes the scratch and dent sale at the grocery store. If a food is dented or it has a leaky seal or a bulge, pass it by even though it's a good bargain, because again, you certainly don't want to end up with a botulism infection by trying to save a few pennies at the grocery store. The symptoms are different than other foodborne illnesses. Foodborne illnesses usually have those gastrointestinal side effects, but with botulism, there's blurred or double vision, difficulty swallowing, speaking, or breathing. And the reason is it's somewhat paralytic in nature. So if someone has gone and never had Botox injections, actually what you're doing is injecting botulism into the muscle to relax it. So it makes sense that botulism is going to cause a different sign or symptom. It's not necessarily gastrointestinal, but it may be swallowing, speaking, or breathing difficulties because you've paralyzed muscles. Now, more information about all these foodborne illnesses can be found at the USDA or the FDA websites listed in your guidebook. Well, what about chemical contamination of food? Generally, we don't think about this, but certainly this can be a cause of illness. Chemical cross-contamination can be reduced by diligent washing. Now, certainly cleaners and sanitizers are used in food production facilities or in food service preparation and can be absorbed by the food and cross-contaminate. So keep in mind that it may be the establishment's attempt to try and keep you healthy and safe. They're cleaning down their equipment and it's not rinsed or processed appropriately, and lo and behold, you've had a contamination from a chemical, not a bacteria. Certainly, skins of fruits and vegetables can become broken and contaminated with pesticides or other agricultural chemicals. Plant and animal toxins, agricultural chemicals, and industrial chemicals can also be part of that chemical contamination. What about physical methods? There's a concept called physical cross-contamination. And any foreign material that doesn't belong in that product, such as glass or bone, metal, or plastic, can end up in food. I actually had an incident where I was using medical grade whey protein for some of my athletes. And what ended up happening is I couldn't get the product anymore. So when I called the manufacturer, I said, well, what's the delay? Why can't I buy this whey protein? And the company told me they rejected all their base material because the whey protein was contaminated with glass shards. So this would be an example of a product that was rejected because it had a foreign material. Unfortunately, if it wasn't caught at the processing, you could have been the consumer that consumed the glass shards. So again, sometimes these foreign bodies or foreign materials can be a problem. These items usually cause contamination by accident in the production facility where the food is being processed. So certainly finding plastic or glass in your food would be another way that you could get ill, but again, it wouldn't be a bacterial. Are there certain populations that are at risk? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. These populations are going to experience more severe symptoms and are at higher risk for contracting a foodborne illness. Certainly infants and very young children. This is one of the reasons why infants shouldn't be fed honey under the age of 2 years, because there might be trace amounts of botulism. Adults are going to be sort of protected from that. Children, young infants and children are not. The elderly, individuals greater than 65 years old. If for whatever reason you have immune compromised situations such as HIV disease, chronic illnesses like diabetes and cancer that may alter your immune system, as well as pregnant women. Okay, so what are the consequences of foodborne illness? Well, many cases go unreported, and usually the estimates of the causes of the symptoms are based on reports by healthcare professionals and health departments, and this is usually associated with a bacterial contamination. So the usual symptoms that you would experience from a foodborne illness would include diarrhea. This may be actually bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramping, chills, fever, vomiting, dehydration. But would you experience any of those if the contamination was a glass shard? Maybe not. Now, we also have food safety regulating agencies. And as I said, the United States Food Supply is one of the safest in the world. And we have a safety net system here of individuals and as well as organizations that sole method or sole source is going to be, can I protect you from a foodborne illness? The goal here of all these organizations is disease prevention. And there are many different levels involved, including federal, state, local public health agencies, as well as the private sector. The goal always here is that these agencies work as a team. Once an illness develops, a local health agency is usually the first to respond. If indeed it looks like it's epidemic in proportion, then state and federal levels become involved if necessary. So if your favorite restaurant has an outbreak of foodborne illness, it may be only your local agency that responds because there's no need for state and federal levels to become involved. But at the federal level, there are 3 agencies that are involved, each with different duties. Certainly the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, they're responsible for the risk assessment of public health hazards. They give us the data on how many Americans are actually infected with foodborne illnesses, and so they give us these public health advisories. The FDA is actually involved in the regulation of low-acid canned foods, imported foods, which is, again, if you're following the news, oftentimes is a real challenge on how are we going to regulate imported foods, pasteurized milk, and certain types of seafood. The USDA Food Safety Inspection Service, FSIS, regulates pasteurized eggs, the grading of shell eggs for quality, meat, poultry, including the slaughter and processing procedures that are used. We also have a system called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And my guess is most of y'all have not heard of that before. But it is a federal process designed to keep our food supply safe. This program was first used in the 1960s for the space program, and it provided 100% assurance against contamination. Certainly protecting astronauts and individuals going into space was really pretty key, because dealing with a foodborne illness that far away from home is going to be difficult to manage. Since then, this system has undergone changes and modifications and is still widely used in the United States today in dairy, seafood, juice, meat processing, and other industries, although there is no labeling for it. So you can't go to the grocery store and find this labeling on the packaged food. It's one of those things behind the scenes that's going on to keep our food supply safe. Okay, what about prevention methods? What are the agency's roles? Certainly food safety regulation legislation that controls processing and handling practices is very important. Some of the new things that are up and coming is what about the irradiation of foods? Some believe that this would be effective in decreasing the rates of foodborne illnesses. Why might it be effective? Because it's going to destroy bacteria and other viruses present on the food. For example, prions, an example of that is going to be mad cow disease, toxins and pesticides, and mercury are all resistant to radiation. So again, although it may destroy bacteria and viruses, there are other things in our food supply, and certainly we all had concerns with mad cow disease. That's going to be resistant to the effects of radiation. Foods can still become contaminated after irradiation in processing plants, grocery stores, or at home. So although the initial plan was that irradiating the food supply is going to eliminate foodborne illnesses, that can't be true because there's so many places along the supply chain where food could become contaminated. Additionally, fruits and vegetables would develop a change in flavor and texture when irradiated, and I think for most American consumers there's a little bit of a concern with this way of protecting the food supply, so you see this less in the newspaper these days. Okay, now what about you? What about you as the consumer? Consumer behaviors that influence food safety. Well, first and foremost, we know hand washing is a must as we prepare food for our family. According to the CDC, this is the single most important means of preventing the spread of foodborne illnesses caused by bacteria. When I first started at the Texans, our players are going from the football field to the cafeteria with no time in between to even use the restroom. So we ended up putting instant hand sanitizing gels in our cafeteria, in the locker room, pretty much anywhere in the football facility to reduce the incidence of foodborne infections. So again, if you're traveling and you don't have access to water, think about those instant hand sanitizing gels and carry those with you in your car. If you're going to wash your hands, it takes about 20 seconds to sanitize your hands. So think about singing the ABCs. And quite honestly, this is a great way to teach it to your children and your grandchildren, is you just suds up, warm soap and water, suds up, and again, sing the ABCs. If your children don't like really hot water, and I'm going to say probably most of us don't like to have our hands under scalding water, just keep in mind it's the contact with the soap and the mechanical action of rubbing your hands that's important. You also need to scrub between fingers and underneath fingernails to make sure that you don't have some kind of foodborne activity going underneath your fingernails or in your hands. Dry your hands with a paper towel, not a dirty dishcloth. So again, you spent all this time in washing and cleaning your hands, and then whoops, you dried them off on something that wasn't very clean. Certainly, keeping the temperature of the food away from the danger zone is really important. So what is the danger zone? If food is between 41 degrees to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, that's where bacteria is going to grow the best. So store your foods at the appropriate temperature. So here's a tip for you. Thermometers rule. If you have a refrigerator, let's say it's an older refrigerator, you need to make sure that you have a refrigerator thermometer to make sure that the foods that are in your refrigerator are stored below that magical 40-degree mark. Now, certainly, again, keeping hot foods hot above 135 degrees, as well as your cold foods cold below 40, is really pretty key. And again, you can't guess. You have to have a thermometer. Never, ever leave perishable foods like egg salads, meat, and dairy products at room temperature for more than 2 hours. Well, a lot of that depends on where you live. If I live in South Texas, I have temperatures that are 95 degrees probably 6 months out of the year. So we have to modify that recommendation and never leave perishable foods at room temperature for more than an hour if the temperature is 90 degrees. So let's think about this for a second. You're going on a picnic and you just have to stop at Grandma's to pick something up. So you left all your food in the car. Well, now that car temperature rises, it gets to above 120, maybe 130 degrees in the car, and you've now narrowed down that window of safety. And again, the key point is, if in doubt, throw it out. Okay? When we're talking about keeping these things at room temperature for more than 2 hours, that also includes preparation, serving, and cleanup time. When you're trying to cool large amounts of food quickly, use shallow containers, because again, the quicker I cool off that food, if I'm going to refrigerate leftovers, the quicker I cool it off, the less likely I am to have pathogenic bacteria grow. Thawing food. Refrigeration or under cool running water are the best methods when thawing foods for preparation. Do not leave food sitting out on counters to defrost, because again, the outer surface of that meat is not going to stay cool enough when the inside is still frozen. So keep in mind that includes your Thanksgiving turkey. Do not let that sit out on the counter for 3 or 4 hours and think, well, I'm going to cook it. I'm not going to use a meat thermometer. I don't think you want to be serving up food poisoning at your Thanksgiving dinner. Cook foods to their appropriate internal temperature, and you can find a list of recommended temperatures in your guidebook. So again, if you're not sure what it needs to be, keep in mind, use that thermometer, check in your guidebook. A kitchen thermometer is your best bet to, again, determine the internal temperature of food products. Another way of looking at this is, keep in mind you have to have a little bit of detective work in your refrigerator. First in, first out. When you're at home, be sure to check the dates on food labels and discard any food that is questionable. It's not just past its expiration date, but is it discolored, odd smelling, or in other ways not normal? Now again, keep in mind, oftentimes foods that are spoiled are not necessarily going to have any of those discoloration or odd smelling. So again, be very diligent with your food preparation and handling. Again, clean hands for everybody involved are a must, either through thorough washing or gloves. Raw meat utensils should be separated from other foods and utensils used in preparation. In my kitchen, I have my kitchen sink on right in the middle, and then I always mess with my raw meats on one side of the kitchen counter and my vegetables on the other. That way I don't have any cross-contamination on my kitchen counter. Although it's not always possible to determine exactly where foodborne illnesses originate, recent CDC studies show of the reported cases, just over half are traced to restaurants, delis, cafeterias, and hotels. But about 18% were attributed at home. So we all have to be careful. We all have to be diligent. Now, what about emergency preparedness? Natural disasters can occur with little notice, and people do not realize the importance of food safety with power outages, flooding, and lack of resources to obtain food. Certainly living in South Texas, we had the unfortunate circumstance of Hurricane Ike. And I can tell you that I did not have a generator. I was not prepared for that. And so within about 2 hours of my food in my refrigerator reaching room temperature, it all had to be discarded. Certainly in areas of flooding, you can have flooded or contaminated water that can get into the food supply. When we lived in New Orleans, when my husband was in medical school, my son got giardiasis, which is a parasitic poisoning from the New Orleans water supply. As the water flooded and went into the city water supply, we all had this wonderful experience with a parasitic infection. The USDA has numerous useful emergency preparedness fact sheets on its website, and it's listed in your guidebook. These sheets cover details with emergencies before, during, and after they happen. The one thing that arises frequently is how long can the food stay in the refrigerator or the freezer without power? And an unopened refrigerator in general will keep food safe for about 4 hours. A full freezer, and the key here is full, will hold the temperature for about 48 hours. If your freezer is only half full, it's about 24 hours. So oftentimes we describe it as food safety. It's in your hands, and I think these are all key points in keeping you safe. Always wash your hands, respect the temperature gradient, and again, if in doubt, throw it out. All right, frequently asked questions. How do I know the difference between symptoms of a foodborne illness and those of a viral intestinal disease such as stomach flu? Hard to determine because the symptoms are similar. So again, you may have the same consequences of diarrhea, dehydration, all of those other kinds of GI issues, but you may not be able to tell the difference. Now, certainly if you've been at a picnic or you've eaten out at an unknown restaurant, those might be the tip-off that it's a foodborne illness and not stomach flu, but not a guarantee. Now, if you're like me, I spend a lot of time at my desk. What happens if you bring a frozen TV dinner type lunch? Do you need to keep it frozen until you microwave it, or is it okay to leave it on your desk for a couple hours? Well, I got to tell you, you either got to refrigerate it or consider using a thermometer to check the internal temperature if you insist on leaving it on the desk. And I think that is a real challenge. So I actually went out in my office and bought a small refrigerator because I didn't want to chance it. And I have a little refrigerator thermometer to make sure that it's below 40 degrees. Now, another frequently asked question. My son has allergies, so I like to prepare his school lunch. I can't refrigerate it though. What do I do to keep his food safe until mealtime? Pretty simple. Freeze your juice pack boxes and use them as a lunchbox cold pack. If your son or daughter doesn't drink juice, you could try actually taking a bottle of water, unscrewing the top, pouring off an ounce or two, and freezing that. That way, as the water expands when it freezes, you're not going to have a cracked plastic bottle in the lunch kit. So that might be another strategy that you can use. Again, it can keep that cold food cold because, again, if it's sitting in that locker all day long, it's not going to be safe. Another question. I've been on vacation. How can I tell if a weather emergency has occurred when I was gone? One of the things that you can do is you put an ice cube in a plastic container in the freezer. If it's melted and reformed, you'll be able to see that the freezer was off for a considerable amount of time. And again, it may be hard to discard food that you don't think is safe, But again, you don't want to be one of those individuals, the 325,000 individuals that are hospitalized for a foodborne illness. Okay, another concern is, do we cool foods in shallow containers on the counter and then place in the fridge? Isn't it bad to put hot food right into the refrigerator? And I learned this from my mother. Don't ever put a hot food in the refrigerator because it's going to wear out the motor of the refrigerator. But again, I'm going to tell you common sense rules. Put those hot foods in a shallow pan and refrigerate it. Now again, you don't want to take a roast that's at 170 degrees and directly place it into the refrigerator. Let it cool off a little bit, maybe 15-20 minutes, but refrigerate it as soon as possible. And again, children being children, another frequently asked question. My daughter does not like to wash her hands in hot water, especially for 20 seconds. Well, back down the temperature of the water. Realize that her skin is a little bit more sensitive than maybe yours is, but make it a game. Sing the ABCs. If that's not her favorite song, find a favorite song that goes on for about 20 seconds and make it a pleasant experience. Sometimes you can get the little soaps that are scented or nicely colored to entice her. And sometimes I'll have families actually put up a sticker chart that every time I catch you washing your hands and singing a song, I'm going to put a star on a star chart for you. And again, after you complete all your stars, we'll have a special trip. So hopefully these tips on food safety have been important, and thank you very much.